The year was 1348, and it felt like the world was taking its last breath. At the gates of the abbey, the usual smell of beeswax and baking bread had vanished. Now the air was thick and heavy. It carried the sharp, stinging scent of vinegar, mixed with the sweet, sickening smell of decay from the valley below. The Black Death wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was at the doorstep. Brother Thomas stood in the courtyard, his hands stained from work. He was the monastery's cellarer, a man who spent more time with barrels than with people. While the other monks were upstairs praying for a miracle, Thomas was down in the shadows, watching over his jars. He was a quiet man who understood that prayer alone wouldn't fill a stomach or stop a fever. The peace of the courtyard was shattered when Lord Valerius arrived. He didn't knock. He hammered on the gate with the hilt of his sword until the wood groaned. When the gates opened, he marched in like he owned the soul of every man inside. Valerius was a wealthy nobleman, but his fine silk cloak was stained with mud and sweat. His eyes were wide with panic. Valerius pointed a shaking finger at the rows of clay jars and wooden barrels lined up near the cellar entrance. He demanded the grain immediately. He had heard the monks still had supplies, and he wasn't going to leave without them. He looked at the heavy jars and made a face of disgust. "What is this?" Valerius spat, kicking one of the heavy jars. A dull thud rang through the stone courtyard. "I come for food and you offer me jars of foul-smelling rot? This water is spoiled. It smells like a tanner's pit. Do you take me for a fool, monk?" Thomas stepped forward, clutching a small wooden ladle. He told the nobleman that the grain in the open sacks was dangerous. It had been sitting in the damp air, and the black spots on the kernels were a sign of the blight. He pointed to his jars, explaining that the rot Valerius smelled was actually a shield. It was the smell of life changing. Valerius didn't want to hear about shields. He laughed, a harsh, dry sound. He called Thomas a fool and a hoarder of garbage. To him, Thomas was just a monk who had lost his mind, burying jars in the dirt and letting vegetables bubble in salty water for months. Valerius pushed Thomas aside. He ordered his men to seize the sacks of raw grain. Thomas didn't fight back. He simply stepped aside with a calm expression. The man was used to being obeyed, but here, only nature was in charge. He watched as Valerius and his men tore into the grain sacks. They ate like animals, desperate to fill the hunger in their stomachs, mocking the monk as they chewed the hard seeds. Thomas knew what was coming. He knew that the grain was a death sentence in this climate, filled with toxins that the dampness had brought out. He looked down at the ladle in his hand. In his jars, a war was happening. The physics of the bubbles, the way the carbon dioxide pushed out the bad air, was the only thing that would survive. While the nobleman feasted on his stolen prize, the great monastery bell began to toll. It was a slow, heavy sound that signaled the first death of the day. But as the sound rang off the stone walls, it wasn't a monk who fell. One of Valerius's men gasped, his face turning a dark color as he collapsed onto the cobblestones. The grain he had fought for was still clutched in his hand. The nobleman watched in horror, his own stomach beginning to churn with a sudden icy fear that no sword could fight. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the very comments where you are watching from. To understand why Thomas stood so calmly while the nobleman died, you have to look back 5 years. Before the plague, there was the famine. The rains had ruined the crops, and the grain in the fields turned to black mush. Thomas hadn't come to the Abbey of St. Lazarus to find God in the traditional sense. He was the son of a brewer who had lost everything when his vats turned sour. His father died broke, but he left Thomas a curiosity about why things change. Thomas joined the monastery because it had the only library for miles. He wanted to know why one batch of ale could save a man while another could kill him. He was assigned to the cellar because no one else wanted to be down there. It was a cold, damp place where the walls always felt wet. Most monks hated the shadows, but Thomas found comfort in them. His days weren't spent in the chapel singing hymns. Instead, they were spent hauling heavy bags of salt and scrubbing the stone floors until his knuckles bled. He watched the jars with a strange intensity. He watched how a simple mixture of cabbage and salt would start to hiss and pop after a few days. To the others, it was just rot. To Thomas, it was a tiny, invisible battle for survival. The abbot was a man who liked order and old traditions. He would walk through the cellar, holding a scented cloth to his nose and pointing his staff at the clay pots. He told Thomas that he was wasting the abbey's precious salt on common weeds from the garden. He said that letting vegetables sit in their own juices for months was an insult to God's bounty. The other monks were even worse than the abbot. They called Thomas the stinking brother. They laughed when they saw him burying jars deep in the cool, dark earth behind the kitchen. They told him that if he had more faith, he wouldn't need to play with mud and spoiled water. They thought he was losing his mind. But then, the great famine really began to bite. The air stayed cold through the spring, and the sun seemed to lose its strength. The monastery's stores of fresh bread and dried meat began to vanish. Thomas watched his mentor, an old monk named Brother Julian, grow weak. Julian's skin turned a gray, sickly color, and his hands shook when he held his wooden prayer beads. It wasn't just that Julian was hungry. His body was failing because the little food he did have was old and lacked the spark of life. Thomas realized then that simply having a full stomach wasn't the answer. If the food was dead, the man eating it would eventually die too. He saw that the physics of the body required something more than just calories. In the quiet of the cellar, Thomas began to document what he called the physics of bubbles. He noticed that when the liquid in his jars turned sour, it stayed clear. Nothing fuzzy or black grew on top of it. He realized that the acidity, the sharp vinegary bite of the brine, acted like a wall. It was a barrier that the sickness in the air couldn't cross. He watched how the bubbles of carbon dioxide pushed the oxygen out of the jars, creating a space where only the good life could survive. He wrote his findings on scraps of parchment, hiding them in the cracks of the stone walls so the abbot wouldn't find them. He became an outcast. While the rest of the monastery gathered to pray for the rains to stop, Thomas stayed in his cellar. He preferred the sharp smell of his fermenting crocks over the scent of the dying world outside. He knew that the world was changing, and the old ways of storing food weren't going to work anymore. The monks continued to mock him, even as their ribs showed through their robes. They saw his jars as a sign of his lack of faith. They didn't understand that Thomas wasn't ignoring God. He was just listening to how the world protected itself. He was learning the language of the invisible, a language of salt, stone, and the slow rise of bubbles in the dark. The plague didn't just arrive, it took over everything. By the middle of 1348, the Abbey of St. Lazarus felt like a waiting room for the grave. The wells were useless, as the water was a breeding ground for sickness. Even the cows were dying in the fields. The air was thick and stagnant. Lord Valerius and his men were huddled in the hall, their faces a sickly yellow. The raw grain they had stolen was half gone, but it wasn't helping. They looked like ghosts. Thomas knew he couldn't wait any longer. He went to the abbot, who looked smaller and older than ever before. Thomas didn't ask for permission. He just told the abbot to follow him. He led the group of monks out to the muddy patch of land behind the kitchens. While they watched with hollow eyes, Thomas began to dig. He pulled away the heavy, wet soil until his fingers hit stone and clay. He hauled up the jars he had buried months ago, their surfaces covered in cold mud. He broke the wax seal on the first large crock. A sharp, pungent aroma drifted out. The monks stepped back, some covering their noses. To them, it smelled like something had gone wrong. But Thomas smiled. He reached in and pulled out a handful of white cabbage, translucent and dripping with brine. He handed a bowl of it to the abbot. The old man hesitated, looking at the sour strings of vegetable. Thomas told him the rot they feared was the only thing that could save them. He explained that the acidity was like a fire that burned away the invisible seeds of the plague. He called it the shield of the sour. The abbot took a bite. He winced at the sharp taste, but then he took another. Soon the other monks were reaching for the jars. They ate the sauerkraut, the fermented carrots, and the salted radishes. They drank the thick, bubbling ale that Thomas had kept in the cellar. This wasn't thin beer, it was alive. Thomas watched them eat. Thomas, knowing the physics of fermentation, had transformed simple garden weeds into a powerhouse of nutrition. The lactic acid had killed the harmful bacteria, and the process had created vitamins their bodies desperately needed to fight infection. Across the courtyard, the scene was very different. Lord Valerius and his soldiers were suffering. The raw grain they had been eating was damp and had started to sprout a black fungus. This fungus made them see things and turned their stomachs into knots. They were weak, their immune systems broken by hunger and the toxins in their fresh food. One by one, the soldiers fell. Valerius died on a pile of stolen sacks, his hands still clutching the grain he thought would be his salvation. He had chosen the appearance of plenty over the reality of survival. As the weeks turned into months, the monastery stayed alive. The monks didn't get the boils or fevers that were killing everyone in the nearby village. They spent their days in the cellar with Thomas, learning how to pack jars with salt and listen for the steady pop of bubbles. There was no grand miracle or flash of light. There was only the patient, calculated application of the laws of nature. Thomas was no longer the stinking brother. He was the man who had seen the invisible world and made friends with it. When the winter of 1348 finally ended and the snow began to melt, the Abbey of St. Lazarus was still standing. The bells didn't toll for the dead that spring. They rang to wake the monks for work. Thomas stood at the gate looking out at the empty road. He knew the world would never be the same, but he had found a way to bridge the gap between hunger and health. In the darkest hour of human history, the smallest organisms, guided by a man who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, had proven to be the greatest shield against the end.